We counted, there are only 66 places on the retreat. There's no room for you, Mom said. I nodded. 3 hours later, their camp lights went out, and mine was just beginning to glow. I woke up to my mother's call, and I didn't even need to turn on the light to realize this conversation was going to ruin the morning. Her voice was dry, like she was reading a summons from the court. There's no room for you this year. 66 people, and suddenly there's one chair missing. I wonder if they're out of stools. Or am I so oversized that my silhouette blocks the view of the lake? And then she added, we told everyone you had a job. A job? What job? Getting fired is a job too, of course, but does it pay? I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window at the morning fog that hung over the water, as if the scene was preparing for my personal failure. For 15 years I'd been organizing this damn family retreat. Booking cabins, writing lists, handing out plats to everyone, and making sure Uncle Paul didn't sit next to Aunt Carol. I was the center of a system that lived only because I propped it up. So when the system decided to spit me out, it did so with one phone call, no fanfare and no regrets. It's all very practical, almost elegant. When I disconnected the phone, my first thought was not that I was humiliated, but that they had invited my ex-husband. Johnny would be there, drinking beer with my brothers, smiling at my nephews, and of course charming my parents. The same parents who turned a blind eye to his 3-year affairs on the side, but saw my wrinkles and fatigue perfectly. It's funny, isn't it? The man cheated, lied and left me penniless, and now he's taking my place at the family table. The logic is ironclad. Throw out the daughter, keep the son-in-law. After all, he's part of the family. That night was longer than any winter. I walked from corner to corner, then sat down, then stood up, then again began to measure the room with steps. I felt as if the walls were listening to my thoughts. The tears flowed on their own, as if my body had decided to wash away its shame. In the morning I sat down across from the therapist and said, I've been replaced. He asked for 3 facts. Just the facts. I wrote down. 1, I wasn't invited. 2, he was invited. 3, they told everyone I was too busy. The facts were like nails hammered into the lid of a drawer. But at least now I knew it wasn't my fantasy. It was their choice. After therapy I met with Linda. She'd always been straightforward. This isn't revenge, she said, taking a bite of her croissant. This is about getting your power back. She suggested. Rent a villa nearby. Bring people there who don't think you're superfluous. Make your own holiday. I laughed at the absurdity of the idea, but inside I already knew it was the only way not to go crazy. After all, what else is there to do? Watching my ex pour wine at the table I'd put together? By evening, I'd already put down a deposit on the house across the strait. Walls of glass, private pier, for bedrooms, terrace. A space where I didn't have to fit into anyone else's expectations. I booked a chef, rented 2 jet skis, a boat, set up a net to play on, invited a photographer. Then I sent dozens of messages to colleagues, neighbors, friends, those who remembered my real name and not the label loser. And yes, I texted Hannah, my sister. Just wrote, if you want to come over. On the 3rd day, I was already standing on the pier in my life jacket, and my relatives were spreading out on the other shore. White houses, matching t-shirts, group photos. And there he was. Johnny. Always well-groomed, in shorts and sunglasses, as if he were advertising family happiness. And his mother next to him. She was looking over people like she was trying to erase me from the picture. Hannah was waving from a sap surfing board and shouting my name. I replied briefly, vacationing nearby. In the evening we ran into each other at a restaurant. My mother came over and said, that looks like provocation. I replied, I'm just lounging around. She rolled her eyes. You're being overly dramatic. Then Sarah, the older sister, came over and grinned. Don't take it personally. Johnny's more fun. Funnier. It's the kind of thing you want to engrave on your family emblem. That was the first time I realized they all spoke the same language. I'm learning to speak my own now. Word spread fast. Teenagers started looking at my pier. Mark, the cook, was making pasta. Laughter rattled under the terrace, and I caught myself thinking, the place that wasn't there for me had suddenly become a magnet. And this was just the beginning. I remember how, as a child, I was always put in charge of being the liaison. When my aunt and uncle were fighting, they would call me, talk to me, you're a diplomat. When it was necessary to take someone to the airport, also me. I was the universal glue for their family cracks. And now the glue man has been fired. It's funny, isn't it? Not even thank you, just no room. I sat by the window tonight with a glass of cheap wine and thought, maybe I really am superfluous. Maybe I am the problem my mother so often whispered about to the neighbors. But then I imagined Johnny sitting in my place at the table, telling his empty stories and getting applause for other people's jokes. And I shuddered. I knew that if I kept quiet, they would repeat this version for the rest of my life. And I would become a ghost in my own family. When I sent invitations to friends, many of them laughed. Are you serious about doing a parallel retreat? But almost everyone agreed. People love a space where they can be seen. I wrote, come, there will be room for everyone. You don't have to be someone to deserve a chair. And I've gotten responses saying, thank you, we've been waiting for an invitation like this for a long time. On check-in day, I tasted freedom for the first time in a long time. I walked around the villa, stroking the glass wall with my hand and thought, this is my home at least for a few days. Here they won't ask why I'm single, they won't look pityingly at my wrinkles, they won't compare me to my older sister. Here would be my version of family. When the first group of guests arrived, I met them at the pier. Jenny's neighbor brought her son, and he immediately rushed to the water. Former coworkers opened their laptops on the patio and said, we're going to work and relax. It looked much livelier than the rows of relatives. In the evening we sat around a long table. Mark served pizza, the kids laughed, the adults argued about movies. I was looking at this picture and I knew I'd made it. And at exactly that moment one of the teenagers said, you have more fun here than they do. The laughter at the table grew louder. I raised my glass and replied, exactly. Fun doesn't get handed out on a schedule. The next day Hannah stopped by to see me. She was standing on the pier, shuffling from foot to foot and said, can I stay for an hour? I just nodded. An hour later, she was already jet skiing and laughing in a way I hadn't heard since she was 16. In that moment I realized, the cracks in their picture-perfect relationship would start to separate on their own. As the sun was setting, I saw my mother again. She stood on her side of the river and looked at me. Her gaze was like a knife, cold and direct. I raised my hand and waved. She didn't answer. And that was the first time I smiled sincerely, because I knew I was no longer a hostage to their table. The morning of the second day didn't start with coffee, but with teenagers crowding my pier like it was a movie theater box office. They came in pairs, groups, some with sandwiches, some barefoot, and all with the same gleam in their eyes. Can I ride the jet ski? I tried to play the strict adult and said, only one at a time and in a vest, but inside I was laughing. It's funny. At official camp they have schedules, coaches, and rules, but they run here where no one makes them march in formation. As Mark pulled fresh focaccia out of the oven, the smell wafted to the neighboring shore. And then the last thing I expected happened. Dad showed up. Harry had always been the kind of man who preferred to keep his mouth shut as long as he didn't have to fight with Diana. And now he was sitting on my pier in a folding chair, eating bread with his hands like he'd dreamed of doing just that all his life. Not a bad setup, he said, chewing. The main thing is to keep everyone happy. That's his favorite phrase. To keep everyone happy. Translation: I'll turn a blind eye to any mean thing as long as I don't have to fight with my mom. I looked at him and thought, this is the man who let my mother cut me out of the family for a picture. He sits there, chewing bread and pretending the world is fine. And I'm that extra detail. But in that moment I decided I wasn't going to fight for his acceptance anymore. You want to eat my bread in silence? Go ahead. But I'm not going to wash myself clean for it. Mom came in for dinner. In a perfectly ironed shirt, looking like the man who owns the lake. She didn't sit down, didn't squat, just stood there like a prosecutor. This is sabotage, she pronounced, as if she were handing down an indictment. I took a bite of my apple and replied, I didn't take anyone away. People choose where they're better off. She pressed her lips together, then said the most absurd thing. You should have thought about Johnny's feelings. I almost choked at that moment. For 3 years he'd been leading me around by the nose, and now my feelings were trash and his were sacred? I repeated, I didn't steal anyone. But something inside me clicked. Up until that moment I was still clinging to the idea that maybe they'd just made a mistake. Now I saw it. They'd made a conscious choice. threw me away to keep me as a convenient toy, and covered it all up with the word family. In the evening we sat around the table again. The lamps on the terrace illuminated the faces of my guests, and I caught a strange thought. There was a lightness here that we'd never had at home. No one competed for status, no one whispered behind my back. Even the kids argued honestly. My team won. No, we did. And that was the real thing. At one point one of the cousins said, "You have a real thing going on here." I laughed. Yeah, it's real. Because I'm not playing their act anymore. On the third day, Sarah, the older sister, came to the pier. She had her hands in her pockets and spoke in that tone you usually use to explain the rules of the road. "You're being dramatic," she said. "It's not personal. It's just more fun with Johnny." Funny, huh? Funnier. I looked at her and thought, that's how one word could justify years of betrayal. I didn't argue. I just said, "We don't have fun on our schedule." She grinned and walked away, and I was left with the feeling that there was a wall between us that could not be breached. Kids and teens continued to flock to me like a magnet. We played games, went boating, laughed so loudly that we could probably be heard on the other side of the river. Then one evening I noticed Johnny standing by the water watching. He was smiling with that very advertising grin of his, as if this whole show was made up for him. My chest tightened, but I said to myself, no, this isn't about him. This is about me. As the sun slipped below the horizon, I went up to the terrace, and for the first time in a long time I felt that I was not a guest, not an exile, but a mistress of space. And it was then that I realized, their perfect picture had cracked, and it was only going to get louder from here on out. The next morning I woke up to a knock on the door. On the doorstep stood my niece, all red from running, with her hair sticking up and a guilty smile. "Auntie, can I stay at your place for an hour? It's boring at their place." I laughed and let her in. Half an hour later, she was already playing charades with my friends and laughing so hard it made my stomach churn. And it was the kind of laughter you don't hear at the long table at your parents' house. It's forbidden by the rules of decorum. In the afternoon we had an impromptu game tournament. At first it was a joke, but then the excitement took over. Even my accountant neighbor was running around the playground with the baby face. We laughed, argued, fell on the grass, and it all seemed like the life I always wanted to have. Without the proper smiles, without the gossip behind our backs, without the eternal who's better comparison. And in the evening Mom came again. She stood on the pier and watched the crowd at my table. Her voice sounded like the pounding of a piano lid. "You're destroying the family." I replied, "No, I'm building my space." She wasn't listening. For her, my no didn't exist. To her, everything was sabotage, betrayal, and a personal attack. I looked at her and thought, is this what love is? When a daughter's feelings are put below the comfort of her son-in-law. I remember at one point she said, "You have to understand, Johnny's part of the family." And that made me laugh. Part of the family is the one who swore allegiance to me and lied to me for 3 years straight? The one who wiped his feet on my feelings? I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Then let him take care of you. I don't have to anymore." Her face twitched as if I'd ripped the mask off her. But she quickly pulled herself together and hissed, "You've always been a problem." I didn't bother to respond. Sometimes silence is the best knife. When she left, I sat down on the terrace and suddenly felt that for the first time in years I had spoken to her without fear. I was no longer afraid of her words, no longer afraid of her disappointment. And it was liberating. I looked at my guests, at their happy faces, and thought, this is what life looks like when you stop being a scapegoat. Later that evening, Sarah came in again. She tried to feign calm, but her hands were shaking. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "You could have just stepped aside and let us live in peace." I laughed. "Off to the side? You already sent me off to the side. And now you don't like the fact that the sidelines turned out to be fun." She fell silent, and something akin to envy flashed in her eyes. Maybe for the first time in years she saw that I had something they didn't. That night we sat around the fire for a long time. The kids roasted marshmallows, the adults sang songs, someone told scary stories. I caught every moment like it was my last. This was my new family, people who chose to be there for me not out of obligation, but out of desire. And when I looked back at the lights on the other side of the river, it was clear to me. There were only cardboard sets. There is life here. And yet I knew the hardest clash was ahead. Because Johnny began to appear too often, standing too close and smiling too confidently. He was sure he could turn things in his favor again. But I was ready, and I wasn't going to stay quiet any longer. I knew this moment would come. Johnny couldn't stay in the shadows for long. He showed up in the morning, when the sun had just risen and the air was as fresh as after a rainstorm. He stood on the pier like a master, smiling as if nothing had happened. I looked at him and thought, this is human hypocrisy in its purest form. The man who had burned out my heart had now come to show confidence. He said, "You can't hide behind your friends and your neighbors' kids forever." I laughed. Hiding? He's the one hiding behind my family's approval. Their lust for pictures and statuses. I replied, "I'm not hiding. I'm building. And you've always been nothing but a destroyer." His eyes glittered, but his smile stayed in place. This type was a pro at playing to the public. An hour later, he was already sitting next to my mother and sister at their long table. I watched from afar and saw them lean into him as he whispered something and they laughed. The very people who thought I was trouble were now holding the hand of the man who had betrayed me. If this wasn't a circus, what was? I turned back to my guests and felt everything burning inside me. I poured wine and laughed, but one thought was bouncing around in my head. They're trying to erase me again. I caught glances at me, curious, sneaking glances. Relatives came to my shore, ostensibly for salt or a plate, but their eyes roamed the faces of my friends. They looked for evidence that I was alone or weak. But instead they saw noise and joy and a life that couldn't be faked. In the evening I made up my mind. I went to their table. 66 people sat there with identical facial expressions, like cardboard dolls. Johnny sat in the center, as if it were his party. I stood next to him and said loudly, "Funny. There's room for everyone but the daughter. But for the ex, of course." Silence hung momentarily. Someone coughed, someone stared at their plate. My mother went pale, and Johnny smiled even wider. "You're being dramatic," Sarah said. I looked at her and quietly replied, "No, I'm living." Those words cut the air sharper than a knife. I wasn't screaming, I wasn't crying, I was just stating a fact. And that's what pissed them off. They wanted my tears, my pleas, my humiliation. But all I brought was the truth. I went back to my own. My heart was beating like a drum. Inside me was everything. Anger, pain, and a strange sense of freedom. Johnny was watching me, and I knew he wouldn't stop. He would find new ways to get into my life. But now the game had changed. Now I had witnesses, I had people who saw what the family was really like and what he was like. Late at night, I sat alone by the fire. The wine had run out, the guests were asleep, only the embers smoldering. I stared into them and thought, my life is divided. There, the family that had cut me out. Here, me who had finally found a voice. But deep down I felt, the real battle was just beginning. Because I didn't yet know which one of them had been holding the knife all along. And then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around sharply. The darkness was thick, with only the sparks of the fire producing brief flashes of light. Out of the darkness came Aunt Mary. She was not one of those who usually came up from their shores. Her eternal smile had disappeared from her face. In its place was weariness and something akin to regret. She said quietly, "You need to know. They're preparing a surprise for you. Tomorrow." My heart sank into my heels. "What kind of surprise?" I asked. Mary sighed. "They want to make you look guilty. Blame for everything. For the divorce. For the breakup. Even the fact that you're here." I looked at her and couldn't understand why she was here. She'd always been on their side. And all of a sudden now, a warning? But there was no game in her eyes. She looked like she was tired of their theater herself. "Thank you," I said. She nodded and disappeared into the darkness as suddenly as she had appeared. I sat by the fire for a long time longer. Thoughts were racing through my head. They're going to make me a scapegoat. It's not enough for them to cut me out. They need me to be a symbol of their righteousness. They need everyone around them to believe that I'm a mistake. And that's when I realized that my main battle would not be for a place at their table, but to prevent them from rewriting my history. The flames of the fire were dying down. I stared into the last embers and thought, okay, let them try. Let them do the show again. But this time I have a stage. And I'm the boss. They can try to paint a picture, but the truth will always find a way out. Even if they have to burn the old sets to the ground. And just as the fire was about to go out, I heard footsteps again. This time they were heavy, confident. And I knew it was no longer a warning. It was the beginning of war. I remembered my childhood. How we used to sit at this very long table and I would try to talk and they would interrupt me. I thought that was the way it was supposed to be. Adults know best. But the years have passed and nothing has changed. They still play royal court where everyone has to wear a mask. Only I refused. I looked at my shore. There were still smoky plates, the smell of fish and bread, and even the empty bottles looked alive. Everything was perfect on their shore. Tablecloths, candles, photos for social media. But if you looked closely, there was only emptiness. I suddenly realized that our noise, our songs, even our mistakes were real. Their order was just a beautiful coffin. And there was something liberating in that thought. I no longer envied their picture. I knew I had something they would never have, the truth. Even if it was unpleasant, even if it cut my ears, it was mine. And that gave me strength. But at the same time I felt something looming. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. I went to bed late, but sleep didn't come. Mary's words rattled around in my head. I imagined them whispering tomorrow, preparing phrases to make me look guilty. I saw their faces, their pinched lips, their desire to humiliate. And the more I imagined it, the more I decided that I would not give them this victory. I knew there would be pain ahead. But in that moment I had a new feeling, angry, burning but necessary. A thirst for justice. Even if I had to burn my bridges for good. I may be alone. But I will not let them rewrite my history. This is my life. And if they want war, they'll get war. I walked out to the water again and looked at their shore. There were still lights burning there, laughter could be heard. But it all felt like a play staged for other people's eyes. There was silence on my shore, but it was honest silence. I knew. Tomorrow they would try to break me publicly. But I was ready. Because unlike them, I had already been through hell. And now I had nothing to lose. And a person with nothing to lose can't be forced into the role of a victim.